So in political science, there is something called the Overton window. Have you heard of this? You heard of the Overton window? I think I first started hearing about it about 10 years ago and had to pretend like I knew what it was. So if you don't know, that's okay. The Overton window is a political science theory that's used to track the stages an idea moves through in the public sphere, from being completely unacceptable, unthinkable, to being actual public policy. And so a politician's job, according to the political science theorists, is not so much to try to move the Overton window, but to detect where it is at any given point, where public opinion is on any given issue at any given moment. As I said, it's not the politician's job to try to shift this window. That's the job of the PR department. That's the job of public relations and marketing. Public relations and marketing, PR, in the business of world building. And the father of public relations, Edward Bernays, some of you may know who he was, wrote in a book called Propaganda that men are rarely aware of the real reasons which motivate their actions. Men are rarely, all of us, are rarely aware of the real reasons that motivate their actions. And then the example that he gives is the selling of pianos. Now, how many of you have pianos? Why? I mean, can you play? I mean, so what Bernays did when he was hired to sell pianos was he advised home builders build music rooms. And then he lined up a lot of spreads in Life magazine and others showing attractive, fashionable housewives with attractive, fashionable children at these pianos and in these music rooms. This is, the 1920s and 30s. Did the same thing with bookshelves, by the way. I don't think any of us reads as many books as we have, but you have these bookshelves, and they got the builders to build the bookshelves. And so then when Mr. Blandings, let's call him, decides one day he can build his dream house, he's finally arrived, and he's going to go up to Connecticut and build, or maybe Millbrook, and build his dream house. He doesn't even think about it, and he builds a music room. And then as he's settling in and unpacking all of his boxes, the piano salesman knocks on the door. And Mr. Blandings welcomes him with a big handshake and says, "My boy, come in. You're just who I'm looking for. I need a piano." Now, Mr. Blandings has already been sold. And when the piano salesman comes to sell the piano, it's as if it was Mr. Blandings' own idea. Of course I need a piano. Edward Bernays' advice to salesmen and politicians was the same. They must be creators of circumstances. They must create the circumstances in which people will demand the product that they're selling, or that they will demand the policy that they promise to enact into law. Bernays taught that if you control the circumstances, you can control or will control the outcome effortlessly, like destiny, as if that new car, or maybe that war, was meant to be. Today's reading from 1 Peter is talking about those who accept Christ and those who reject him. And quoting Isaiah, Peter calls Jesus a stone, specifically a cornerstone. Quoting Isaiah, he says, "See, I lay a stone in Zion, a chosen and precious cornerstone." And Peter continues, "Now to you who believe, this stone is precious. But to those who do not believe, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, and a stone that causes people to stumble, and a rock that makes them fall." And it's important to note in this passage that Christ is the cornerstone, but he doesn't change. Those who believe and those who don't believe, he's still the cornerstone. And that underscores, I think, the idea that Christ doesn't change. Our response to Christ will change, can change, but he doesn't. The point of difference is also important. To those who believe, Jesus is precious, but to those who do not believe, Jesus becomes the reason they fall. So it's obvious there's a kind of a word of judgment here. Unbelief has negative consequences. But then Peter added something that made me think of Edward Bernays. They stumble because they disobey the message, which is also what they were destined for. And I emphasize the word destined here. And Peter isn't denying free will. He's saying that the unbelievers will stumble because they choose to stumble. But he also says that they were destined to. They were destined to fall. which sounds like a contradiction here. And probably this is one of the most difficult things for us to wrap our heads around. How do we reconcile free will, our choice, with a God who orders the whole universe for us? But that's why I thought of Edward Blandings. We'd go back and say, I said Edward Bernays, why did Mr. Blandings buy his piano? After all, it was his idea. He used his free will to buy the piano, but why did he need it in the first place? Why did he think he needed it in the first place? And as I said, it's because the home builders of America got together with their Madison Avenue PR departments, and they created all the right circumstances for the piano builders of America to sell pianos. And it's all as if it were meant to be, as if it were destined. Talking about building homes here, but Peter is talking about building a different kind of home. Peter says, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Now, all of us have had an argument, right, or a long-running discussion with someone, and we've reached the point where we know we're just never going to convince our opponent. We're never going to change his or her mind. We're just not going to convince each other. We've all had those kinds of arguments and discussions, really. And that's kind of the point I think we've reached today in our culture on any number of topics. Our long-running discussions have reached a point where we know neither side will budge. And I think that's because increasingly we find ourselves living under different sets of circumstances. I mean, we're living side by side. We're living right next to each other, but we're living in entirely different worlds, it seems. Now, Bernays wrote in the 1920s, at the beginning of the radio age, at the dawn of mass media. And he was one of the ones to quickly realize how powerful mass media would be in terms of creating circumstances for millions of people at a time. Today we live in an age of media fragmentation and media tribalism, but I don't think this fragmentation means that media's power to create circumstances and to create worlds has diminished. And each of these worlds is destined for a certain outcome. How many of them, however, will glorify Christ and call him Lord? In spite of this fragmentation, I submit to you that the same power that once rallied the masses to mass destruction now speaks individually, but still very powerfully to us on those little blue screens we all carry around in our pockets. And what's behind those little blue screens? This is where I'm going to say Satan, right? The devil is in your phone. Throw it away. Let's burn them. Now, what's actually behind those little blue screens? Well, it's a computer, right? And it's made out of silicone. And this is one of those happy occasions, happy circumstances, because one of the images in today's reading is about being living stones. What is a living stone? Silicone, the Latin word, when you translate, the Latin word is, the root is silex or silicus, which means flint or hard stone. So it's the very opposite of a living stone. And Peter says we are to come to Jesus, the living stone, rejected by humans, but chosen by God. And when we do, we will become like him. We will become like living stones. So, if you are what you eat, if that's true, and then maybe if you are what you worship, maybe if that's true too, this is kind of the distinction that he's talking about here. If your gods and your idols are silver and gold and stone, then you're going to be silver and gold and stone yourself. You won't be real. You won't be an animate being the way God created you. And if your God is this little blue screen behind which is just hard stone, you'll be like that too. So Peter tells us to come to Jesus, the living stone, and he will gather us together to become like living stones together. If you have a chance after the service, go up and look at that cross behind the altar, because it's one wonderful depiction of stones, and it's meant to symbolize each one of us being gathered into that. Going from a dead stone, a hard stone, a flint stone, to being a living stone means that our worlds will change and our circumstances will change, and even our destinies will change. No longer are we destined to fall through disobedience, but destined to stand with him who for our sake fell on the cross and now stands at the right hand of God. And to this fact, Stephen, the first martyr and the first evangelist, bears witness. in the reading. Stephen, full of the Holy Spirit, looked up to heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. "Look," he said, "I see heaven open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God." But those to whom Stephen spoke could not see what Stephen saw because they were living under entirely different circumstances. They were children of another world. They were even children of another father. So instead, they covered their ears and, yelling at the top of their voices, they all rushed at him, dragged him out of the city, and began to stone him. We can tell that Stephen belongs to a new world, one that operates by a very different set of circumstances. Because the last thing that he does before he dies is fall on his knees and cry out, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." In other words, Lord, do not judge them by their circumstances. Lord, do not let them be defined by their sins. Lord, do not let the prince of this world determine their destiny and decide their fate. Now, could you show that kind of mercy? I would have a very hard time showing that kind of mercy to people about to murder me. Maybe I could in that moment, but I would have a much harder time showing that kind of forgiveness to someone who murdered my wife or murdered my children. I remember 16 or so years ago now, there was a horrible home invasion in Connecticut where that happened, where a husband was tied up and thrown in the basement. His wife and daughters were murdered or raped and then murdered, and all he could do was sit and listen. My own wife and children were that age at that time and living in Connecticut. And like Millbrook here, we left our doors unlocked. And I thought, I personally wanted to go find those killers and bring justice to them. And I don't think I would have been lacking for company with other fathers and husbands willing to help. And I thought, I tell you this to illustrate what a different world Stephen was living in the moment he died. How different the circumstances, how very different the destinies. And a lot of people will say here at this point, well, he forgave them, so we should forgive them too. We should, abolish the death penalty. We should, tell it's really society's fault. It wasn't the killer's fault. And okay, it seems to me that's like a way of saying it's all your fault. If it's society's fault, it's a bit of blame shifting. And they'll use Stephen's words to make their point. And Stephen is quoting the highest authority here. He's quoting Jesus himself on the cross. Jesus from the cross says, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." But to just simply say forgiving like that is easy is to preach a cheap grace and to preach a false mercy, because it doesn't understand that the penalty here for disobedience to God's law is in fact death. And that's our circumstance. That's what the whole world has been condemned to experience. And Peter draws that point home when he says they stumble because they disobey the message, which is also what they were destined for. So that destiny is the circumstances into which we're born. It's the world we live in, and it is our destiny unless we return to Jesus Christ, who was rejected by humans but precious to God. We humans reject Jesus because we cannot accept any other set of circumstances than our so-called right to choose for ourselves what is good and evil and what is true and false. And so in doing that, in making those choices for ourselves, we construct a world that promises us freedom when we sin and assures us of mercy when we disobey. But that's not the gospel, and it's not the gospel that Christ died for, and it's not the gospel that Stephen died for today, and it's not the gospel that allows someone like Stephen to forgive in impossible circumstances. This is the gospel that both of these men died for. And Peter closes with summing up what that gospel is. There's 4 points to it. First, Peter says we're a chosen people. God has chosen us, which means God determines the circumstances in which we live, now and for eternity, not the world. Second, we're a royal priesthood. Priests are intermediaries. The Latin word for priest is pontifex, which means bridge builder. So we are to build bridges between our communities and God, between God and each other, between our communities and each other. And that's the vertical of the cross is building that bridge to God, and the horizontal is building that bridge with each other. Third, we're a holy nation. This means that Christians are a definite and distinct group, and they should behave as such, that we should be different from the world. We're called out from the world, even though we remain in it. The whole point of 1 Peter, which we've been reading all Easter, is to underscore and focus on this distinction and why it matters. And fourth, we're God's special possession. And this amplifies the word in Greek for nation, which is genos, a people, but maybe race would be even a better word, because it underscores the fact that ethnicity has nothing to do with our salvation, because the Christian race, the Christian people, are composed of every ethnicity, drawn out of every nation. We're a spiritual race, a chosen race, not defined by color or culture, but defined by creed, which is to say we're defined by who we believe in. Our faith in Jesus Christ now defines us. Finally, we are all these things, a chosen people, a royal priesthood, God's special possession, so that we may proclaim the excellence of him who called us out of darkness into his marvelous light. And so darkness, everything I've been talking about in this sermon, the set of circumstances, the propaganda, all of those worlds that are built for us and that we build for ourselves and that determine our earthly fates, the world in which we're born and condemned in, that's darkness, and we're called out of that. And we're called into light. And to explore light would take another sermon and take many more sermons. I encourage you to come on Ascension Day and hear the sermon about glory. The first, however, we catch a glimpse of that light, though, at the end of Peter's message today. It's in God's mercy. Mercy we can't possibly deserve and that we can't possibly imagine. Peter concludes with that light shining. He says, once you were a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Amen.